Morning again. After a brief respite last Sunday, thanks for your adaptation. I was just talking with our team this morning. In the launch of Wellspring, we had full COVID mitigation restrictions, and we're still sorting out what it looks like to be a brand new church. And since that time, there's been so many different moments when we're like, okay, now this popped up. What are we going to do, and how's it going to look, and what are we going to, adjust to? And so it's good to be back in person with you all and giving some space for everyone to recover and heal and get back on our feet. And again, prayers for those who are still in the midst of that. This morning, we're continuing our series. That's the Gospel reading of John. Our series called Fear Less. We've been engaging since Ash Wednesday, the start of the Lent season, different fears that emerge in our lives. And what do we do with this thing called fear? What do we do with this thing called anxiety? How do we handle it? Is it possible to be fearless, or is it really what God's call is to be those who fear less? Right? That's kind of been a common theme that you've heard throughout these Sundays. As I said in the beginning of our service, Palm Sunday marks the start of Holy Week. Palm Sunday, the triumphal entry, is when Jesus sits upon a donkey, we just heard it, and enters into Jerusalem with this celebration of the crowds. And there's all this energy and excitement that's happening. And all four Gospels have this story. Not all the Gospels are the same, and not all the Gospels have the exact same stories in them, but this story is in all four Gospels. And the interesting thing is, it's earlier in the Gospels for some of them. Matthew 21, Luke 19, Mark 11, John 12. And if you think about it, Jesus' ministry lasted years, and yet in the Gospels, the last week of his life is giving a lot of space because of the importance. At that time, they weren't working with like Google Docs or Microsoft Word to, just endless word counts that you can keep typing and typing, right? They had limited scrolls and limited space, so the space they had was important. And so what they put in there had to mean something. And to give so much space to Holy Week, to give so much space to the last week of Jesus' life, tells us something about what they are trying to convey. It's one reason why we place such importance as a church on walking through the story. So if you're here for Palm Sunday and then all of a sudden you wind up on Easter, you've missed the story. You've missed the story of gathering around the table. You've missed the story of what happens in those spaces, of washing feet, of betrayal, of Good Friday, of the sins being brought to the cross, of having to wait to see what in the world is going to happen after our hopes and dreams for salvation have just been crucified. I say that because I encourage you to walk this story this week with your community, the various services that we offer. Palm Sunday is kind of a culmination. It's this rise. If you think of like in movies where maybe you've watched, movie buffs where there's so many different threads happening, right? Different people running in this spot and teams over here, and all the threads are kind of coming closer together, and the suspense and energy is building. Well, you see that happening in the Gospels till you reach this point where you're kind of on the edge of your seat, and that's what Palm Sunday initiates. Palm Sunday is just like this culmination of all these things that we see happening, because up until this point, Jesus hasn't been saying, don't actually call me the Son of David. Don't say that out loud. Don't refer to me as these things, right? Keep it under wrap. But yet on Palm Sunday, blind men proclaim him as the Son of David. They're shouting, Hosanna, King, save us, right? It's this moment in which the revelation happens of who Jesus is and what he's about. And it gets attention. Palm Sunday is not just a moment of energy, not just a moment of revelation. It's a deeply political moment. The entry into Jerusalem is taking place right at the doorsteps of what's called the Passover. The Passover had a lot of heritage and deep roots for the Jewish people. It it celebrates the time in which they were freed from oppression from the Egyptians. You remember Moses and the Exodus and the Red Sea and all that. That's what the Passover commemorates. And so the Passover always had a lot of tension at this time. Why? Because at this time, the Jewish people were under the oppression of the Roman Empire. Caesar was king. Pontius Pilate was governor over that space. Herod was there, right? There are these Roman installed leaders who are seeing to this. And when the people all gather in Jerusalem, it's like when Chicago raises the bridges, right? It's like when they put the roadblocks up, that's what Jerusalem would have been like. Why? Because if revolt's going to break out, if rebellion's going to happen, if something's going to manifest, it's going to be during Passover. So not only were a lot of Jewish people coming into Jerusalem, you would have seen the centurion and the Roman governor and the prefects all coming in, because he didn't live in Jerusalem. He would come to Jerusalem for that time of the Passover. Why? Because presence was needed. Just a reminder who's in power. To add to the symbolism, palms were being waved. We waved them this morning, and we're going to wave them again. Palms were being waved. And palms aren't just like, you know what, it'd be really cool and look really pretty when Jesus is coming into Jerusalem. Let's just we don't have ribbons, let's just find something we can wave. Oh, here's some palm trees, let's use that. No, rather, like, palms had deep significance for the Jewish people. Many centuries earlier, Israel was being oppressed by the Seleucid Empire. And a guy by the name of Judas of Maccabee rebelled. He's also known as Judas the Hammer, right? That's his weapon of choice. And he was a fierce warrior. And because of what was happening in the world dynamics, they were able to actually break the yoke of oppression. This revolt took place. And to commemorate and celebrate the success of this revolt and the building of the temple, what they wave. It's like the Jewish flag of the time, if you will. We see this actually in Scripture. This is in Revelation when God brings all the nations together. It says, after I looked, and there before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. They were wearing white robes and holding what? Holding palm branches in their hands. And they cried out in a loud voice, salvation belongs to God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. What are they holding in their hands? They're holding palms. It's a sign of celebration. And notice what they're shouting. They're shouting this affirmation of authority. They're shouting this affirmation of God's power and salvation and victory. They would print palms on coins as a part of their nationality. Lastly, we see Jesus riding in on a young donkey. And from the gospel reading, we heard that comes from an ancient prophet by the name of Zechariah, in which this Messiah, this king, would enter on a young colt. And Jesus intentionally, this isn't Jesus saying, oh, I just found a young colt over here, maybe that will work. It says Jesus, he tells him to go and find, here's this family, they have this young colt, go get that thing for me so I can ride it in. And they didn't necessarily understand, the disciples at least, they didn't understand what was happening what Jesus was orchestrating, but yet they realized, wait, this is what he was saying. I am that king. And what you have to understand, the actions being taken by Jesus are highly intentional. It's not like Jesus was like, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to be political. My bad. I just be king over your heart. No, Jesus says, I'm orchestrating and revealing something to you all of who I am and what I'm about. He purposefully arranged the symbols and the timing of his entry to reveal these political elements of who he is and what he was doing. And these political elements would have been in direct conflict with the reigning system of government, that is the Roman Empire. Anytime I'm working on sermons, and you can ask any preacher when a topic's been on your mind, you begin to kind of see all these things pop up around you, like, oh wait, that ties in, and that ties in. And I saw recently in the world news that the Taiwan leader is coming to visit the U.S. They're going to swing by, and it's supposed to be a vacation or something like that. But you might have heard that there's been a lot of energy around a leader visiting a location. There's been a lot of threatening and things happening around that. And if that happens just even with like those kind of simple moments, imagine if that leader was intentionally saying, I am doing this, and almost flaunting it, if you will, what kind of energy that would manifest. Now, not everyone was celebrating or waving palms, though. Not everybody was excited about this thing Jesus was doing. In fact, there were people who were deeply afraid. There were people who were filled with fear. And one of those groups was the religious leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. In fact, they gathered together right before this moment, even with what Jesus had been doing before, because they're seeing all these signs manifest. Look at the things he's saying. Look at the things he's doing. The people are going after him. And so they gather this council, and they say this, what are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And listen to this. And the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Now, let me ask you something. If Jesus was just, look, I'm just talking about heaven and how to get your golden ticket to heaven. Just your soul. Don't worry about what happens in the present, in this moment. Why would the Pharisees be afraid? There were plenty of religious priests out there. There were plenty of religious persons observing things and teachers of the law, and yet they weren't sitting here concerned that because of what was happening, because of the politic of what Jesus was revealing, that there could be backlash. And they have actually reason to be afraid. It wasn't some 50 years later, after another revolt takes place, that the Romans do come in. And they wipe out Jerusalem, and they tear down the temple, the second temple, brick for brick. The Pharisees are trying to stop this thing from happening. The religious leaders knew politics mattered. And they were afraid of what Jesus' politics might cause for them and their nation. Politics. Great word, right? Makes us nervous. Makes us apprehensive. Reason why we sometimes don't want to go to our Thanksgiving dinners. It puts us on edge. Maybe when you hear the word politics or things start getting brought up, you feel the back of your hair and your neck kind of stand up a little bit. Like, oh no, how do I get out of this as quickly as possible? In politics, even when they're functioning at their best, it can feel tense, it can feel uncomfortable, it can feel even divisive maybe. And I mean, I don't have to say what politics can feel like at their worst. I mean, just toxic and harmful, even deadly. There's reason to feel anxious around the word politics. You just look at our world. You just look at the U.S. and you see the sectarian hate and the toxic political energy that is at a dangerously high level. I love how Ernest Min says. He says, politics is the art of looking for trouble, finding it whether it exists or not, diagnosing it incorrectly, and applying the wrong remedy. And that's how we feel about politics oftentimes. There's nothing good that happens from politics. Nothing good can come from this. Why in the world would the church want to talk about politics? Actually, it's a common phrase that I hear. I've heard this, not just from being a pastor, but in any church I've been in, the church shouldn't talk about politics. And there's usually a tagline on there to say, you just need to stick with Jesus. Just stick with the Bible. Right? And it could have been one of our half-truth sayings from our last sermon series. And I understand what they're saying. I understand what's trying to be articulated there. But it also reveals a lack of understanding as to just what the church is. It reveals a lack of understanding of what it means to be the people of God. So what do I mean by politics? Do I mean that I'm going to stand on stage and drape my favorite national flag behind me and say, you bring my favorite political leader or party up here and we need to endorse them? No, absolutely not. That's called Christian nationalism. That's a heresy of the church. Stay away from it. What do I mean by politics? Actually, I like to think of every politician, every political party, every form of government as an equal opportunity for critique. So politics, I like how Brian Zahn says it. He says this: politics is the organized attempt to attend to the affairs of the polis. What is polis? The city or the society. It's a way of trying to organize a community. At its very basic level, politics is where are things being positioned, where's power at, where are these things at, and how do we organize this together, right? You can think of it as the inner dynamics of the way a community gathers together. And politics, at its basic, it seeks to understand, seeks to answer the question, how we as human beings live together. How do we live together? What does this look like, right? What does this mean to be together? You know, there's a lovely phrase that we say all the time: life is better together. Life is better together. And politics is actually part of what it says, what makes it better. What is this thing going to look like? And why do I say that? Why am I mentioning that? Because politics, in a sense, is almost inescapable. There's reasons why famous philosophers like Aristotle says, man is a political animal. You know, they're trying to say, like, you can't get away from it. Where two or more are gathered together, there politics are among you. That's what it is. The question isn't whether or not we're going to be political or not. That's not the question. The question is, whose politic are we living? We're not asking whether we're going to be a political group or not. By mere fact that we gather together, by mere fact that we gather around a table, by mere fact that we confess Jesus as Lord, a king who Scripture says every power, every government, every form of power, every future power that will emerge has been brought underneath his feet. And that's not just saying, I'm up in heaven not worrying about things. That's saying that's a statement of authority, of just exactly who Jesus is in control over. So when you say Jesus is Lord, you're saying something political. You're saying a profound statement about who you're following and what kind of leader you want to follow. And when Jesus is entering into Jerusalem on this donkey, proclaiming himself as king, and people are laying down palms that are signs of an incoming king and waving these things and challenging the governors who would have been riding on their war horses coming in to Jerusalem, you see something happening at the ground level. Jesus isn't saying, I just content with being in your heart. He says, I want to be in control. I want to be in authority. I want to be Lord over your whole life. A lot of times, years ago, you remember early 2000s, maybe you don't remember, and that's probably a good thing. There was those T-shirts that would be like, Jesus is my boyfriend, or like, Jesus is my home dog, or it was kind of a way of trying to get trendy with the culture or something. But we kind of think of Jesus like that sometimes. I want Jesus to be my friend. I want Jesus to be my counselor. I want Jesus to be my support and care. But guess what? You don't get to have that without Jesus as Lord. And if you think you get to have that without the lordship, then you really don't understand what the gospel story is telling you. Whose politics are we going to live? Are we going to live into politics of empire? The ways in which we've inherited language of whatever political party or TV station or news radio station that you love to listen to? Are we going to resort to those tactics and tools? Or are we actually going to say, Jesus, maybe you have something to show me? Jesus' politics. I love the phrase of, we're not of this world. What does that mean? That means that Jesus enters in and you see this almost upside down politics, almost this upside down power at work. And it looks a lot about what we're going to celebrate here in a moment, this self-sacrificing love. It looks like not being the Judas of Maccabee with the hammer and revolt and seeking power in the ways of war or oppression or violence, but rather riding on the tractor into Jerusalem rather than entering in with a tank. Allowing the hammer to be used against yourself upon the cross. That's the kind of power that Jesus calls the church to. There's moments in Scripture, here soon we're going to talk about Good Friday and Maundy Thursday, and when Jesus gets threatened by the religious leaders and Peter lashes out with the sword, and what does Jesus do? He stops it and says, absolutely not. He actually heals the guy. He heals the person who's seeking to put him to death. Earlier in the gospel story, they're about to go into a Samaritan village, and they actually reject Jesus. And what do the disciples say? They're like, Jesus, you want us to call down fire on this village? Like, we've seen this happen before. Is this time to start dropping the bombs? Is this time for us to start using violence? And Jesus actually rebukes them. I like how Stanley Hauerwas says it. He says, the church does not exist to provide an ethos for democracy or any other form of social organization, but stands as a political alternative to every nation, witnessing to the kind of social life possible for those that have been formed by the story of Christ. I like to talk about this, and many others talk about this as the third way, a way different from that which the empires of the world ask us to partake in. So I want to give you just a brief summary. What is Jesus' politics? What does that mean? If I say Jesus' politics, if I would have to summarize that in 50 words or less, how would I do that? Well, my first thing would be to look at the Sermon on the Mount. That is the most concise teaching that Jesus has. It's like his kingly edicts to his people. This is what you're to be about. What is the summary of that? He says things like this. He says, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Turn the other cheek. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Love your enemies. Be merciful as your Father is merciful. Does that sound like the politics we're accustomed to? And yet this is the very thing that God himself displays in our history, in our creation, in the person of Jesus. And he says, if you want to be a follower of me, this takes precedent over every politic, over every form of approach to being with and for each other. One of the things I love about the story of Palm Sunday, of Jesus entering Jerusalem, is immediately the first thing he does is go to the temple. And he discovers all these different tables in the temple. All these different tables that have been set up. Money changers and doves and all sorts of things happening. They were taking advantage of the church. They were blending things together in the ways they shouldn't be. And what does Jesus do? He begins to flip these tables. Begins to drive it out. I like to contend that sometimes when we say, Jesus, come on in, Jesus, be a part of what's happening here, he does the same. And the tables we've set up and the altars that we have set up that aren't his begins to push him over. And sometimes we're like, whoa, Jesus, hold on. Not this table, not this table. And yet Jesus says, look, I have a table already, and I've invited you to it. All people are invited to my table. All people get to come in, no matter who you are, your culture, your demographic, your identity, whatever it may be, you get to come and be a part of what I'm doing here in my kingdom. And yet we were like, okay, that's great, God, but just remember that this is my favorite table. I want to hold on to this. Friends, part of what we do here as a church isn't just speak about platitudes or just the private prayer closet. When we as Wellspring begin to say things like love your neighbor, that we should feed the hungry or give food to the hungry and clothe those without clothes or take care of our kids in our school district, whatever it may be, that's a way of organizing life together. That's a way of being community. That's a politic. That's political, believe it or not. So I'm going to ask you, it's not whether you're going to be political or not, but whose politic do you want to follow here? Whose politic do you want to be about? And I hope we all can wave our palms and say, King Jesus. I love that Palm Sunday falls on our first Sunday of the month because we get to celebrate the table. It says in Philippians 2 that Jesus humbled himself. He gave up the power. He gave up his heavenliness, if you will, and came and entered into creation in the form